Hey, everybody. My guest today is Joseph Tsang, and we're going to talk about ICE immigration and deportation. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, everyone. This is Joseph. Nice to see you all.
Okay, so I have a bunch of these questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the answers are. So I know that many people have seen these videos of ICE taking people off the street and deporting them. So I think a lot of people really want to know what's happening. These videos seem to be quite dramatic, and honestly, when I watch them, they bother me, you know? So I want to get a better understanding of this as well. The first question I have is, how does ICE target people?
They definitely have a list. That's one thing, of who they're supposed to try to track down and target. They don't necessarily prioritize that list right now because of the quota that they have, the increased amount of quota, just like cops have number of traffic tickets they have to give. Same thing with ICE. And so they have certain centers that they're going to. For example, ICE has been going to just Home Depot, right? And they've been going to nightclubs. They've been around for decades now, so they have a pretty sophisticated understanding where a lot of illegal immigrants, people who are undocumented, all kind of gather and reside. And this includes churches and schools. Now, in previous years, they had a pretty strict guideline not to go to religious organization places of worship and gathering, not to go to schools. They don't bother people unless they've been processed or they've been in the criminal justice system, and they go after the people that are high priority on their list. But because of the change in narrative in politics, now some of them, especially in California, ICE officers are just going to different places where they could try to be able to gather more people. Some of it's for publicity purposes, but some is not. So that's kind of like a general idea, right? And so how do they get this list? Well, USCIS feeds that list to them. These are people who we've rejected. These are people who are illegally here in the US, presumably, and this is their last address. And this is all the information we have on them. Immigration courts have certain information as well, right? And the customs, CBP, they also have these lists. Now, other than these three other immigration arms, various state, police departments, schools, employers, I audits. A lot of these other organizations also have lists of people who are undocumented or who are likely undocumented. Now, sanctuary states, they generally don't provide that information to ICE, so ICE doesn't have it. But in other states, right, in largely Republican cities and states, they are much more complicit. In the sense of or not, they're much more compliant in the sense that they provide a lot of this information so ICE can go after them. So that's kind of a big overview about how does ICE have a list and know who to go after.
Okay, I remember the rhetoric from the Trump administration was that they were going to target criminal undocumented immigrants, criminal illegal immigrants. But I watched an interview with the director of ICE, and he said that the vast majority of people that they, I don't know, arrest or detain are not criminals or haven't committed violent crimes. So I guess, is that because of the quota that they have to meet?
Yes and no. Majority of people who are undocumented don't have major criminal issues. And so for ICE, for the people who are going through deportation, it's mainly because they're undocumented. They don't have paper. They don't have a way to stay in the United States. They cross the border illegally. They overstay their visa, and so so they're not complying with the U.S. immigration laws. That's why they're getting deported. That's the vast majority of people. There are for sure lists and criminal organizations, but if you think about it this way, if they are criminal organizations, if they are highly suspicious, they are going to evade ICE way better than the average person, right? And so it's much harder to get them. And when ICE has a quota, and when you have to just get all these people out, and that's under executive authority, you kind of almost go for the easy low hanging fruits.
I see. Okay. So another thing that people have questions about is the fact that these ICE agents cover their faces. I remember the director of ICE saying that that is to protect the ICE agents because people will try to dox them and people will threaten them and their families. So what are your thoughts on that?
It makes sense from their perspective and ICE as an organization has to exist, or else people would just violate all the immigration law. Right? They are the only enforcement arm of all of immigration arm. Right? USCIS doesn't do it. The immigration courts don't do it. CBP officers don't do it. Like nobody else actually enforces the immigration law of kicking people out other than ICE. And so and then again, police officers, the FBI, that's also not what they do, right? So somebody has to do it. And if somebody has to do it, they have to cover their faces or else the entire family will be threatened, right? And so that makes sense. Now, however, we just met with CBP, ICE officers, and they are required by law to show their badge to show, or else are they just kidnappers, right? How do you identify, a group of people in unmarked cars and plain clothing coming out and without any sort of identification with masks on, three, four people kind of jump you, like, in normal circumstances, when you see that happening on the streets, civilians, other passerbyers, they can go in and try to stop and say, "Hey, you want to protect your fellow citizen, right?" And you could do a civilian arrest and fight off and be a vigilante and fight off these criminals. But if it's a police force, then you're like, okay, we cannot get involved. We don't have civilian arrest authority. And so when other people try to stop them, ICE agents are required to show their badge. They're not required to show their face, but they're required to show their badge.
Interesting, because I've seen a number of videos where people ask them for their identification, and the agent doesn't seem like he's doing anything. He's just standing there. So, and then, when I see videos like that, I'm thinking like, how do we hold these people accountable? Right? One is the one problem is what you stated, which is who knows that if these people are legit or not. Something can just wear like a vest with like ICE written on it, right? So we need to have some way to like authenticate that this person is who he says he is. And the other is the accountability. Like, what if they use excessive force against somebody, right? If we can't ID them, then we can't hold them responsible.
Right. Yeah. So if you're a bystander and you are in fear that one of your relatives or you see something going on, they're getting targeted. Um, Normally, the way ICE conducts these activity, there's definitely more than two people. Sometimes it's like six or eight, and they're all masked together. And anybody else can say, "Can we see identification, or we're going to stop this and we're going to call the cops." Right. And, I'm not going to let you detain this person. Right. Now, the ICE can also go ahead and detain you. They could detain anybody. Right. Which I know we could talk a lot more about, but they are required to show their badge, and you can live stream the entire situation, right? So you can like video and live stream and say, "Let me see your badge and make sure you're not a criminal," right? I'm trying to protect my fellow citizen here.
Okay, yeah. So that's another question that I had, which is detaining somebody, right? And what rights they have to detain someone. When I watch these videos, you don't really get the full picture, right? It usually starts in the middle of some sort of conflict, or somebody's kind of like running towards a situation, and you don't know what happened, prior to that. So you said that they can just detain anybody.
Unlike cops, who needs to have a reasonable suspicion to stop, to arrest, right? They have all these procedural grounds. They have to have reasonable suspicion, which you created a criminal offense before they could stop you, right? I mean, and to arrest you. And if they don't, then you could just drive away, right? That's generally the idea that we understand from dealing with law enforcement. ICE, however, they have one goal. Their goal is to see if you are lawfully in the United States. So how can they possibly know that? How can they possibly know anybody is a visa holder, is a green card holder, is a citizen that renounced citizenship but got back a green card? Is this person on parole? Right? There's a ton of different legal statuses in the U.S. Their main goal on the streets in this political climate is to make sure that the people who are undocumented, who are illegal, they are the ones getting detained and deported. So, with that being said, basically, they can detain anyone and everyone. And the conference I just came back from, the American Immigration Lawyer Association, it's the annual conference. We go every year. There were thousands of immigration attorneys there. There were ICE officials there, and they were sharing. And this is something I would not believe unless it was told to me straight out of their own mouth, and that is that US citizens have been detained. not for 2, 3 hours, not for 2, 3 days, but 2, 3 weeks, locked up, detained just like everybody else. And that's absolutely crazy to me. But once they explained it, I understand how that could happen, but it's still bizarre. So going back to your question on, who are they going after and how are they detaining people and how do they know? Again, they don't know, and that's the whole point. They're trying to ask and to try to find out. So if you cannot prove you're a citizen, and then they detain you, and people don't know where you are, you might be in a unfortunate situation where you get locked up for 2, 3 weeks, right? So we know plenty of U.S. citizens who can't speak English, right? Maybe they're seniors, maybe they're much older, maybe they're hanging out with a bunch of people who are undocumented. Maybe they look like they're undocumented, the way they dress, the way they conduct themselves, right? And they get picked up by ICE, and now ICE is processing everybody, and person couldn't communicate, and no family member or friends came to try to find them, right? The only reason why they eventually found out was because the family members eventually saw their relative's name on an ICE list and went to get them.
So how does ICE figure out if you're a citizen or if you're lawfully here?
So they are supposed to run your fingerprints and try to find your data in the USCIS database. And what's crazy is that that process actually takes some time, right? Anybody who wants to find anybody's status, the only place and the only organization that have that information is USCIS. And they have to get information from them just like everybody else. They file a request and then wait for an email response. And sometimes that could take a long time. And for every inquiry ICE makes, they actually have to pay USCIS. At least that's what I've been told, right? USCIS, when states try to contact them to find out individual status information, when people have to find, like, when local governments, when the other federal governments are trying to find out information, they have to contact USCIS. Is this person a green card holder? Is this person legal? USCIS has to run a report, find their files, have an officer read through it, and then report back. And that costs money and costs time. And so there's a delay. And if an ICE officer is extremely busy, it spends a couple days just to process everyone before emailing out that request. And it takes another couple days before they respond. And they don't have time to kind of read it and find it. And then maybe, and these people, they're detained, they get transported all around the country, right? It's not like, oh, you're just, sitting on a sofa waiting for your name to be called. Well, you need food, you need shelter, and so they put you in a detention center. And then that detention center is full. You get put on a bus and driven to the next closest detention center. And so that's why some unfortunate soul who was a U.S. citizen ended up being detained for weeks.
That's crazy. So let's say hypothetically that I get picked up by ICE. I just tell them like, look, like I'm a US citizen, but they don't know that. I don't carry my passport around. Like who carries their passport around?
Right.
Right. So they detain me. I'm just like sitting in a detention center. And so I just gotta sit there and wait. Like, can't I call people?
You have no right to an attorney. Yeah, so that's something we can talk a little bit more about, which is the idea of due process. Um, but in your case and in my case, they have so many indicators of what we're saying is true, right? The fluency of English. We could talk about our backgrounds, where we went to high school or college and all these, and it's more likely than not that we are actual U.S. citizens, right? If we claim that. Now, what it gets more tricky is if we're not fluent in English, we didn't naturalize, or we naturalized just very recently, and we look and in every which way just like other undocumented individuals. And in immigrant communities, whether you are from the Middle East, whether you're from Asia, whether you're Hispanic, right? We know uncles and aunts and grandparents who might not speak English fluently and who might conduct themselves even though they've been here for 20, 30 years, they might still behave and talk and sound like very much immigrant, even if they're U.S. citizen, right?
So this leads to my next question, which is I've seen a number of videos of ICE agents like detain people at court. I just see like this somebody maybe just walk right outside of a courtroom and then ICE just like picks them up and takes them away. What is that about?
Most likely they're waiting for the result of that trial. And basically at the end of that trial, they probably lost. the case, and so they get detained. But I mean, and then the case, meaning they were trying to find a way to stay in the U.S. and they fought through the system and they lost and they have absolutely no right to be in the country. So ICE just immediately picks them up, registers them. Now, that's I think one thing to think about. Just because you get picked up by ICE doesn't mean you automatically get put in detention. ICE doesn't actually want everybody in detention because it costs the government a lot of money to put people in detention. It's contractors who hold these detention centers and they're already all full. So they have to pay like an extra surcharge. So it's really expensive. So ICE doesn't actually want people to be in detention. They want to register people. That's been the whole narrative, that there are all these people who are undocumented, in a sense that the government has no idea who's here and who's not here. So they just want to register people. So ICE picks people up, registers them, and says, okay, now just come back in a month and tell me where you are. Right? They just want to write down their name, their address, their phone number, and make sure they come. And or you could self-deport. You could leave. We're not gonna spend government money to kick you out. Just leave. Right? We'll let you go home, pack up stuff, and just let us know when you're gone. So when ICE picks people up, a lot of it's to register people. Or, okay, we have to detain you, but you could apply for bail. You and your family get a bail. There's an ICE bail and there's an immigration court bail. So there's two different types of bail and then once you are on bail, then you can leave, then you can pack up, then you can leave the country, right? So when ICE picks a lot of people up, if they don't have a criminal offense, if they don't have a flight risk, if they are not likely to be a danger to public safety, generally speaking, ICE doesn't actually want to detain these individuals.
That's interesting. Okay. I thought that they were taken directly to some sort of detention center. I didn't know that. I guess like the first step would just be to register the person. And then you're saying a lot of those people who get taken away by ICE are then released after they get registered.
Yes.
Okay. But some of them who get registered are taken directly to a detention center or no?
Yes. So there's definitely situations where they do their risk assessment. Then you have a tool where they plug in all the factors and it runs assessment. Should this person be released on their own reconnaissance, or does ICE use their discretionary authority to release them, or is it a mandatory detention? So they have this risk assessment that they use, which they use it less than 50% of the time. So that doesn't give you a lot of confidence, right? So been a internal report in 2022 and 2023 that says ICE is really not using the risk assessment tool that they're supposed to use. And so they're just detaining a lot more people than they should, but they're technically supposed to. And then, but there are people who are supposed to be mandatory detention. And those are people maybe with the criminal records, right? Public safety, or they just have no viable claim to stay in the United States and they just need to go through immigration court and get deported. And that includes green card holders. So it's not just undocumented people, that's just not including like visa overstays. A lot of these people are actually green card holders as well.
Wait, so what happens to these green card holders? If you have a green card, that means you're lawfully in the country, right?
Yes, unless you violate the condition of your green card. And so let's say
Oh, I see.
you committed a criminal offense. Now you are deportable, even though you have a green card. And so you get stopped, you get put into ICE proceedings, and then now you're going to go through immigration court. And now you're supposed to prove to the government that maybe you committed a crime, but it's not, a crime of moral turpitude, so you're not supposed to be deported. Maybe you're trying to get your green card back through cancellation or removal, another equity defense, but now you have to go through that immigration court battle.
I see. I see. Okay. So what's this thing about people being deported to countries that they're not from?
Most of the time, those individuals are pretty serious criminals that the home country doesn't want. So the home country doesn't want them back, so they can't even send them back. Or they're waiting for this long um, trial. They're appealing it, right? And so if they're appealing their immigration case, then they technically still could potentially win and could come back into the United States. But during the meantime, they have to be housed. And so the question is, housed in the US, which state, or can they be housed overseas? And so that's another big debate, right? If you're appealing your detention, and you want to fight this all the way up to Supreme Court, then where can we hold you? should the taxpayer be paying all of this detention time and it's really expensive, right? And so where can they do it? Can we find a place that's cheaper overseas?
Okay. So, in regards to what the law says, has Trump changed the law or is he just enforcing the immigration law more strictly?
He is enforcing the immigration law more strictly. He's enforcing it to pretty much to the maximum in certain respects.
Okay. So, in terms of like, well, like ICE having quotas.
That's I think always been there, but he definitely increased it. So let me give you some examples, right? So in January, President Trump issued the executive order saying that we are under invasion, and so we want to heighten security. So custom border, their responsibility, and how they scrutinize cases of all people entering the country is now zero tolerance, right? So customs officers, just like police officers, just like immigration officers, they have a lot of discretion when they adjudicate cases. How many questions should they ask? Don't ask, don't tell. There's so many different rules based on different administrations. And when Trump issued that executive order, zero tolerance, it basically erased almost all discretion. And so if you find anything wrong, anything small, you have to treat it as if it's a very serious offense. And so that caused a chilling effect to a lot of people, both at the border and people flying into the country, where a lot of people just dare not come because a lot of people have little issues here and there, some 5 years ago, some 10 years ago. And maybe it was fine in the previous 8, 10, 12 years. But now, if it's zero tolerance, they could be detained. And we actually saw this, one of our clients, 70-year-old man, US citizen children, US citizen spouse, himself almost became a US citizen, but just couldn't, and didn't apply for the application. And he had a little small criminal offense 20 years ago, drug related, but flew in, bam, detained 6 months. Green card holder, detained 6 months, and still detained, by the way, now because of an offense like 20 plus years ago. Zero tolerance policy, right? He's flown in and out of the country for decades, not a problem. Zero tolerance, immediately picked up, completely out of the control of CBP officers.
Oh, it's interesting. Okay. So I think this gets to the big question here, which is due process. I've heard people talk about due process and how these immigrants don't have due process. But why don't we start with this concept of due process? What is it?
Due process is based on the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. It is saying no person shall be deprived of their life and liberty or property without due process, without an avenue to fight for your rights, right? Your life, your liberty, your belongings. And if you don't have that, then we live in a tyranny. So that is codified. Now, what's interesting is it says no persons. Is It didn't say no, it didn't restrict it to citizens. It isn't restricted to visa holders. It's all people residing in the United States. So if we're going to neatly split the argument into two sides, there's people who say all of these undocumented individuals, criminal or non-criminal, they need to have their due process. And if ICE agents can pick them up, put them in expedite removal, put them go to third countries and kick them out without legal representation, without a chance in court, without preparation, then they don't have due process and they're violating the Constitution. On the right side, they're saying the president and our constitution, we prove they have the right, the government has the right to be able to do that to non-citizens because they don't have that due process right. And even if they do, the executive power overrides that because it is just that much, national security is that important. That is the general straw man version of the argument on both sides. It gets much more complicated when you look at the specific nuances. And I think there's a lot of things that the public doesn't actually quite understand. I think we need to add another layer of premise.
Okay. So due process and refers to the right to an attorney and the right to be seen before a judge to determine if there has been an infringement on your life, liberty, or property.
Yes.
Okay. But since ICE can detain anybody pretty much, and people who were detained by ICE do not have a right to an attorney. many people think that their due process is not being respected.
Right.
Okay. So people on the left are saying, look, the Constitution says persons, not citizens. So
Yes.
it should include immigrants, even undocumented immigrants. The people on the right are saying, no, it should only be restricted to citizens, even though it technically says persons in the Constitution. And even if it does mean persons and not citizens, there is an overriding factor involved, which is the right to control our borders and to deport people who we think are dangerous.
That's right.
Okay, so what is this other layer of nuance that we're missing?
Yeah. So you're looking at due process in just a one single definition kind of a way, but in reality, we actually accept that there's different layers of due process and they're not all the same. For example, if you are in a civil lawsuit, right? Somebody you owe credit card money and you don't pay it, and or somebody slanders your name and you sue them in civil court, it is not the same due process as a criminal court, right? Where the state, the Commonwealth, is going after you. There, you have a right of a public defender to defend you, right? So civil and criminal, it's a different due process. And then you have a right by your jury, and the evidence is also different, right? In federal criminal court, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Almost everybody has to agree that that you committed this crime before you can be convicted. In civil court, you don't have to have unanimous consent, right? And so there's different levels of burden of proof. There's different levels of protection, both at the civil versus criminal, and then this also changes if it's state versus federal, right? Federal crimes and federal lawsuits has also a much higher requirement compared to most state level crimes. So that's again another distinction. And then we go on to more nuance as well. Um, if you're in a small claims court under like $20,000, just you and your neighbor disputing over a patch of grass, if you have an employment dispute, right? My employer didn't pay me enough and they owe me back wages, and you're going into employment court. Those don't even have like a formal judge setting. It's just like another adjudicator. They have the rights of a judge, but they could even take in hearsay evidence. So employment court, small claims court is different than civil court versus criminal court. State and federal is different. And we implicitly, as a society, understand, okay, different arenas, different situations have different due process. And we accept that, we understand that. The same applies to immigrants. Immigrants, if you are going through applying for a benefit with USCIS, it gets denied. When you file a motion to reopen, when you're filing an appeal, it's with immigration court. Those are not with the traditional federal courts. Those are under immigration courts, still very much part of the federal government, the executive branch. It's not really a judicial branch on its own. And so they have their own very limited avenue and burden of proofs and oversight by the public. So that's with the normal legal way of applying for citizenship. Now, when you're illegal, when you're undocumented, then you have even less rights. And I think that is where the right, that is where the people who are pro ICE detention and deportation and enforcement is saying, we implicitly accept all of these different layers of due process, and non-immigrants or people who have violated the law and they don't have any equitable claims to be in the US, why give them all the privileges of the normal due process? And it would just slow everything down. We are already super backed up in the immigration courts, that they are just draining the taxpayer money. Why don't we just expedite remove them? So that is their argument. So I think the middle layer that I think that the public, most people don't understand, is that it is not just do you have due process or do you not have due process? I think the main question is, where do you draw that line? How much due process should these people get? How much due process should we have in our immigration system? And would it break our immigration system? And would it be harmful as a public policy in our country if we give them more? And if we give them less, does it actually forfeit our rights? So what kind of country do we want to be in? That is the nuanced discussion that nobody's having, and everybody is just using this straw man argument. They have due process. It's the Constitution, and then the right side says no, they don't. We have the right to kick them out. So, what do you think, Jason?
Yeah, that's definitely complicated. So, I've definitely heard the distinction between civil and criminal court. Is the idea that criminal court is reserved for people who have committed crimes and civil court is reserved for people who just have disagreements with other people?
And like money damages and things like that, right? You
Okay,
just violated one other person, and you can pay for it with like money. Whereas criminal, it's you're gonna have jail time. You know,
I see. I see. Okay. So, criminal court has a higher bar of due process. Okay. And then you're saying there's a distinction between state level and federal court. Does
yes.
federal court have a higher bar for due process?
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay. All right. So then now you have immigration courts,
Yeah.
which you said are not a part of the judiciary branch or part of the executive branch. So where does their bar of due process lie? Is it like pretty low, pretty
it,
high?
it, it's pretty low. So there's not, when I say low, I mean there's not a lot of oversight training to be an immigration judge. Now you can always appeal their decisions to the federal courts, but you're taking that one extra step, right? And so there's been a big push on trying to move immigration courts and immigration judges into a normal federal court, but that seems to be a losing battle these days. So I don't foresee that happening in the next 4 years. So immigration judges largely now have to like listen to whatever the executive branch is saying, and they can execute accordingly. Now they're also completely swamped. There's way too many backlog cases in the past 5-10 years that they can't process fast enough. There's not enough immigration judges to process everyone, and so with all of these backlogs, and people are waiting for a court date, people are waiting for a trial, and they can't, and they're already doing like Zoom like online trials that just last 10 minutes, one case, 10 minutes another case, 10 minutes another case. So like you don't really even have a chance to really present that much, and when you do present that much, is it a very fair hearing and fair adjudication when the judge is that swamped, understaffed and untrained? That's what I mean by it's a very it's lower compared to the state judges and also the federal court judges.
Okay. So you're saying, all right, once we understand the complicated situation, the question is not necessarily whether they do have or do not have due process. The question is how much due process should they have?
Right. As a country, as a public, as the people, what is the best? What should we have?
Okay, but if somebody gets picked up by ICE and they're detained and they don't have a right to an attorney, what's the due process there? Like, well, what's the minimum level of due process? Like, if in that situation, it doesn't seem like there's any due process.
Yeah. Um, Here's another thing to complicate matters. Does somebody have due process overseas? So the Fifth Amendment is pretty clear that's in the United States. So there's a huge difference between when somebody is denied their green card and visa overseas versus if somebody's denied their green card and visa here in the United States. And right now, whether you agree or disagree, there's almost zero due process overseas. You can't even appeal it. You know, there's you can apply again and make your argument, but there's just it's almost entirely up to the executive branch. So that's one thing. Now, with that in mind, right? So we're talking about legal immigrants. We're talking about people who have done everything. Their spouses and their families are U.S. citizen. They almost have every right to be, but for some reason, technical reason, they get denied. Okay, so you have these premium quality immigrants overseas that got denied. No rights, zero, nada. And then you have, let's just imagine almost one of the worst, right? Just for the sake of contrast, somebody who crossed the border illegally, entered without inspection, have multiple criminal records, who have no equities in the U.S., have no chance to be able to stay in the U.S., and who is a threat to public safety. But maybe they are part of a gang and they're very wealthy. And how much due process should they get? Should they have a right to an attorney? Should they be able to fight their trial and stay in the U.S. and get bail and fight all the way up to the Supreme Court? And if they can get it, then we have to multiply that by the millions, right? Because of the millions of people who are undocumented, of the millions of people who have entered illegally. And so, again, premium quality immigrant got denied for a small technical reason, no due process rights. Somebody who's illegal, criminal here, how much due process rights should they have? So that's kind of a way to think about it, right? Now nobody's even furnishing the argument for the overseas individual, because there's actually no constitutional basis for it. There's not various nonprofits that we work with that are trying to overturn that, but again, that's probably a losing battle in the next few years, right? Um, so we're not even talking about that anymore. So now let's just focus on the people who are here. What kind of due process should they get? And it's hard because of the scope and the magnitude of the situation, right? And it's also complicated because of the historical situation. And in another way, it's also hard because it's almost entirely self-inflicted. The United States did it to ourselves in many of the ways, and that's what makes it even more complicated. So history plays into it. So let me explain. In the past, it wasn't so much that we had open borders, right? This whole idea is a problem mainly because of the whole, we have a nation, we have a border, and we need to protect our border, and everybody could come in, then it makes our nation meaningless, right? That's the argument that we hear. In the past, it wasn't that way. If you go really back, well, the land wasn't even ours. That's for one. But the second is before the immigration law came into effect, there was no severe consequence if you overstay your visa or if you cross illegal, right? And for example, let's take a look at Native Americans. There's many Native American tribes that live both in Mexico and in the United States. So they cross the border continuously. And there's a lot of people who just cross through. They work here, they live in Mexico. So until the United States created the immigration law that made it such a serious offense that you crossed illegally and then you stayed, and then now you're permanently barred, you cannot come back to the US, then it created this problem where people are like, oh no, if I leave and I can't come back in, then I'm just going to stay here, and then therefore they are quote unquote undocumented, right? So that's the some additional historical context to why there are a lot of people who are illegal here because they crossed the border. They were accustomed to doing that until the U.S. history changed their law, and then now they have these bars. Then other complications is that people who are fleeing persecution and then they cross the border legally seeking a better refuge, right? Filing for asylum, filing for refugee status. And then there are a lot of people who are undocumented or illegal here in the US because their cases got denied. So maybe they entered legally with a valid visa, they filed for a valid green card or a valid for an extension, and then due to whatever reason, it got denied, and then now they're stuck here and they don't want to go back. And so they're also illegal and undocumented. And so, or not so much undocumented, but more so they are without papers, right? They don't have a valid document to allow them to stay. So with all that historical context, now there's so many people, and what due process should they have? It's a very messy situation due to the somewhat broken immigration system that we've had for the past 50 to 100 years.
Yeah, that seems very complicated. I wanna go back to this database that you referred to. You said that when ICE detains people, they are going to, get their fingerprints and then try to get their immigration status from a database that's run by USCIS. Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. How accurate is that database?
I want to say it's pretty accurate. I haven't seen any major pushback saying that it's wrong. I mean, we do FOIAs, we probably do like 20 FOIAs a week at our office. And so when you do a FOIA request with the Freedom of Information Act and we pull files from the government, when we do get it, it is, 99% correct in the sense they have everything on you, like every single thing. When did you enter? What documents you submitted in the past? They could find all this information about you. So when they do get it and find it is fairly accurate. Rarely do I see like, I mean, maybe like 1% of the time, it's like, oh, there's a few things that was missing that should have been there, and you didn't find it, but I know it was there, right? You redacted too much. You should have given us something that you're not giving us. But generally, if you're trying to find out, is do they have legal status? Are they a citizen? Are they a green card holder? That's a pretty fast search and find.
Interesting. Okay, so then is it fair to say that being having I don't know, like them actually submitting a request to see your immigration status is some level of due process? Or maybe that's not really due process because maybe that's due process that they need to do in order to protect citizens from getting deported. So let's say that our position was that these, people who we suspect to be undocumented immigrants don't have due process at all, right? But we do know, as ICE, we're assuming we're ICE here, that sometimes we might sweep up a U.S. citizen in our operations, and we have a right to the U.S. citizens to make sure not to deport them. And if that's the case, we have to check every single person that we detain to see if they're a US citizen, right? So maybe that level of due process, it's only there to protect the US citizens, and it's not there because we think that these undocumented immigrants deserve that due process.
Right. And also in our judicial system, we believe due process in the sense of not just a one-sided due process, as in our European counterparts, right? In the US, we believe um, we have the right to defend ourselves. And the judge is there as an impartial arbiter of this justice and deciding the facts. So there's the government versus us, and then we defend ourselves and we submit our claims and our equities. And the government is trying to submit their claims why we don't deserve it, and then we have a judge to decide. That's the system of justice that we believe in. In other countries, judge, prosecutor, and defender is all rolled up in one. They decide everything. And so in one form of quote unquote due process is, yeah, sure, ICE will double check with USCIS, and if you are in the data bank, then they release you. Oh, so you do have some level of due process, but that's not the American definition of due process.
Okay, so the American definition of due process specifically refers to the right to an attorney and the right to be seen by a judge or something like that.
Right, right. Not necessarily attorney, but at least you have the right to defend yourself and make your arguments why you shouldn't be detained, you shouldn't be deported. Um, but I mean, let's just break it down some more. Let's say you do have a right to go through immigration court. The process by which ICE and the United States government has made it, it's almost null and void. Meaning, let's say there's a person who have good arguments, and they don't even need an attorney to make an argument for them on why they should be released. Okay. Their spouses, their children, U.S. citizens. They are, a big philanthropist. They're highly educated. They own multiple properties. They're big investors, but wrong time, wrong place, and they got swept up by ICE, and now they are somehow in this proceedings. Okay, let's just grant that fact pattern. Sometimes people are locked up for 4 months, 6 months, 12 months before being able to go through immigration court and trial. And you are detained the entire time with everybody else in an environment that is arguably worse than many of the jails. And so, even if you have due process and the right to make an argument, you're pulled through this terrible process that people strictly just give up and say, please just deport me. I'd rather give up everything in the US and just go because this is so bad and so horrible. Right. And we know and we've read reports of people, the situation is so miserable, they just commit suicide in the detention centers because it's just maybe they don't speak the language, maybe they don't understand what's going on. No family has seen them, nobody knows where they are, and they maybe have medical issues. They just give up, right? Like months and months and months, you just kind of lose your sanity. So it's a pretty difficult situation. And that's assuming we grant the idea of, okay, we'll give them due process. But the process is so bad, what kind of due process? And there's another saying, right? Justice delayed is justice denied. Even if you grant them the justice of a due process proceeding, If you drag it out through the immigration courts and through detention centers, that is valid under current immigration law. Is that even true due process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember you said in our last interview that the immigration courts are so overwhelmed and that everything is going to take so long because of it that it seems that even, yeah, if they were to be given due process, it would just take forever. Huh. I don't really know what the solution to this is. It just seems like we have to hire more immigration judges.
Then it's going to cost more money on the government, more taxpayers, and more immigration judges. Does that mean more funding for ICE as well? Is it, so exactly how important is immigration in our country? How important are immigrants in our country? How important are undocumented illegal immigrants in our country? And that's the thing that I don't think both the left and the right are really talking about. What is our identity as a country? And maybe it's just too complicated and nobody knows how to articulate it, and nobody knows how to be able to talk about it in a way that is as fair and right, right? Maybe everybody has an agenda and they're trying to get elected or whatnot, but that is sort of the state of our union. We have a lot of undocumented, a lot of illegal aliens in the country. There are more coming in every single month. And the US in the past has been able to thrive with them in our society. But have we reached a tipping point where we are no longer thriving and we need either an scapegoat, or we need or it's actually too much and we need to change a narrative? Like, what's going on? Exactly what is our policy? There's no doubt that the United States have benefited both economically and socioeconomically, politically, from the amount of undocumented immigrants that have entered the country in the past 50, 60, 100 years. But do we want that as a country? Seems like the Republican Party do not think so. And so now there's a complete shift in tone, and the American people elected a president who has promised to be tough on immigration. And so democracy allows for that to happen. And now the way President Trump is dealing with this problem, and to fulfill his election promise, he increased the authority of ICE. He Congress is supposed to fund ICE, so ICE has already used up almost all of their budget for 2025. And so whether or not Congress will give them more to deport more people, that's up in the air. But at least Trump has done what he can in issuing the executive order, making it a no tolerance, heightened tolerance policy, and having ICE trying to detain and deport as many people as possible. Is that right? Is that wrong? Is it the way he's doing things that's incorrect? Obama actually deported arguably more people than Trump has, both in his first term and now. But no, there was no outrage because the way Obama did it is now very different than the way Trump is doing it. And maybe that's very intentional. Maybe Trump is doing it in a way to get a lot of publicity, a lot of great pictures to show his electoral base that, hey, I'm doing exactly what I promised. Effective or not, that's a different story. But I'm doing what I promised. And is that right? And is that what the American public wants? So I think the more philosophical question we as a society needs to really answer is, how much due process should people have? And how much are we willing to pay for that? And then there's more things to talk about. Should people overseas have due process? And how much presidential power should a government have, even if it's self-inflicted?
How did Obama do it?
He definitely opened up a lot more immigration courts. He sped up the deportation proceedings. He did a lot more expedited deportations. He also, allowed ICE to do a lot more, but it wasn't the raids, right? It's not like what you see in LA and the videos. They went after a lot of people on the list. They focused much more on the list, right? Going after the criminals, going after people who have no equities, and then deporting those individuals, as opposed to just massive, like on the ground, disturbing swap meets, disturbing schools and religious centers, and just picking up anybody who doesn't speak English and processing them. Like that's, he didn't do it through the publicity, but just did it with the sheer numbers. And there was no public outcry because if if somebody was ruled by immigration court that they don't have any equities, that they are deportable, and then they get deported, well, they got their due process, right? They literally went through the entire system, and they were found to not have any rights. And a lot of these people have been in the US for 5 years, 6 years, knowing they're going to be deported. So they prepared and then they left. So no public outcry. But here, without the immigration judge and due process, picking up people on the streets, putting them in third countries, and everything happening within a few months of being elected, that's why the public has been in outrage.
Okay. So the Trump strategy is almost kind of like a fish net that just that kind of drags in all the fish, the illegal and legal fish in the net.
Yeah, and then process everything, but a lot of it, is, I think, publicity. I mean, I mean, in what way? He got what he wanted. He got power, right? Now, because of the executive authorities, the executive orders, he has these rights, even though it's being challenged by the courts. But now everybody's paying attention to him. Everybody's waiting on every drop, every word, every stroke of a pen. Everybody's watching him on a daily basis, right? He got the power, and he got the pictures and the videos to prove to his base that he did exactly what he promised. And so, if within the first 6 months, the first year, he completes everything he promised, then it frees him up for the next 3 years to do all the other things that he wants to do, right? Potentially. I don't know. I can't read his mind.
Interesting. Okay. So from your perspective as an immigration attorney, what do you do? Like, what do you advise your clients?
I advise them that many ICE officers and immigration judges and CBP officers and USCIS officers are good people too. At least I fundamentally believe that. Maybe there is a new wave of new ICE immigration officers that are more bad apples than good apples, but there are good people, and there are career officers, meaning they've been there from the past administration to now. And if they have a good case, trust in the system and prepare your case well before you get detained. So some people are undocumented and without papers, but you could still prepare a case why you should be out on bond, right? Maybe you will be deported if you are caught, but at least prepare your case so if you are caught and you are registered, you can communicate to them, I'm very sorry. I'm here for my family. I will self-deport in 60 days. Let me pack up my belongings, please. Here's everything. And show them that, right? So depending on the client situation, if they are citizens and green card holders, okay, if they're green card holders, I recommend them to try to become citizens as soon as possible. If they're citizens, I recommend definitely prove that you're a citizen. You have that resource available quickly, especially if you can't speak English. And then if you are not yet a green card holder, you're a visa holder, right? Prepare your case well so you can become a green card holder, and so you don't get detained. And then if you are undocumented, prepare your case well, because maybe in the future you could become a green card holder, right? But in all cases, my advice now is don't live in a state of fear, because it paralyzes the needed energy you need to live your best life. Because in whichever case, the United States immigration system rewards those who have value. It's very self-interested, very utilitarian in that sense. So if you can live a really fruitful life, if you are very important to society, you can get a lot of letter recommendation. You are a good father, you're a good mother, you are a good worker, you're a good employer. If you are a major contributor to society, ICE and the other departments take that into consideration whether or not to deport you. So if you're living in fear and it paralyzes you and you just feel like you're stuck at home all day, well, either try to break out of that and live your best life now, or you might as well self-deport, right? Because you can live a better life elsewhere. But in whichever case, do not live in a state of panic and fear at home.
Okay, so for citizens, you said, you should be able to prove your citizenship. So doesn't that mean we have to carry our passports around?
I actually do. I actually carry my passport card and my global entry card. Even though I'm fully certain, if I do end up plugging ICE, I would not have to pull that out to prove my identity. But for other people who are fluent in English, who have been here for a long time, who do have a passport number and whatnot. Um, that I'm not too worried about. I think the main people I worry about are people who don't speak English well fluently, or they might be a little bit older, or if they're disabled, and or people don't know where they are and they just kind of like to roam around on the streets on their own. Or yeah. So those individuals, if they get picked up by ICE, and further, if they look like an illegal immigrant that ICE would target, those are people that I would say, yeah, you probably should carry a passport.
Everything that you've told me seems to suggest that ICE has a lot of discretion.
They do, and they don't. When they're when they run a person's information through their data bank, if there is a mandatory detention, that's beyond their control now. They have to put the person into detention. When USCIS and CBP officers call ICE to pick somebody up, they generally have to go. I've seen certain cases where maybe a customs officer at the border or at the airport say, "Hey, this person should be detained. You know, based on our analysis, they should be detained." And then ICE says, "We don't want to go there. We're understaffed. We don't want to." Then CBP officers, okay, then we'll release them on our own. But generally speaking, ICE is they're sort of like the police force where they have to kind of execute what's required. Now they do have the discretion after registering a said individual to whether release them on their own accord or through a bond. That's the real discretion that they have. And for most people, yes, they should be released.
I was referring to the fact that they can just pick up anybody. Right?
Oh,
Because like, it seems like because you were saying, well, if you look like an illegal immigrant or somebody ICE would can think looks like an illegal immigrant, you should be extra careful, maybe, like, take these steps,
yeah.
right? But then that assumes that there's a particular look, right? So it just seems that they have wide discretion in terms of who to pick up. It's like, "Oh, that person's like a brown-looking person," like, they don't look like they're American because the way that they're dressed. We're gonna stop them.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, that's not wrong, right? Like CBP officers, TSA officers, they use quote unquote statistics and also prejudice, right? Prejudice, your hunch, it's what they it's what their training has been, and yeah, so they could totally do that.
Yeah, this reminds me of that Arizona law that got passed a number of years ago. Something had something to do with this, right? Had something to do with immigration enforcement, and the law made it such that it gave law enforcement officers wider discretion on, like, who to stop and who to detain, right? Like, if somebody looked like an illegal immigrant or something like that, and then they even gave us specific examples of, like, how they dress and even their shoes.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, the whole quota system, right? They have to detain and check and register so many people. They have to try to deport so many people. And I mean, from the perspective of the Republican Party, they're trying to clean house, right? They're treating these undocumented illegal people in a sense like they are trashed in the house. They're trying to do spring cleaning, and one way to do that is just to have a quota. How many trash bags can we take out every single day, every single month? And ICE is the only agency that can do that. So please go ahead and do that, right? Go. If they don't have equities, just go through expedited removal procedures and get all these people out. You don't have any additional funding, so do your best. That's what people have elected Trump to do. And so this is democracy playing out exactly and he hasn't he's squarely within his presidential authority, right? He's not using the Enemy Aliens Act. He isn't using wartime powers, even though he's using wartime language, but he's still within his powers. And so this is the president that we have, and this is what he's telling his executive branch to do. So who's going to stop him? Is Congress going to stop them? Is the judiciary going to stop them? Are the American people outraging going to stop them? Right. So who's really there to say no to this?
Well, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. I really appreciate your knowledge and your expertise on this.
Yeah, pleasure. I love immigration. We talk about immigration all the time, but it's really fun talking about it with you in a philosophical light, right? We're not just talking about politics. We're not just talking about individual clients and how to win their case, but it's much more societal, right? Political philosophy.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.